Lemkin Solitaire and Equalizer seeders and planters offer disruptive innovation like vertical banding, dry and or liquid onboard fertilizer, and great prices. Go to lemkindemo.com for more information and to request a demo. Thanks to our show sponsors, Corn School, FMC Pre-School, and Nutrien and eKonomics. Find the answers for today's ag challenges on The Dirt. Brought to you by eKonomics, The Dirt provides expert conversations on nutrient management, markets, weather, and current trends shaping agriculture. Join Mike Howell for Season 4 as he digs into new insights, new guests, and new topics that will help you make better decisions on your farm. Listen to The Dirt on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or visit nutrien-economics.com.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Agronomists here on this St. Patrick's Day. Yes, it is Monday the 17th. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith. I am having a wonderful time finding as many green things as I can. And yes, I did this on purpose. I did, in fact, make tonight's episode about nitrogen that driver of green in our crops. Before, of course, we start, if you collect those CEU credits, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists. Let us know you watched the episode. We'll get you signed up for those CEU credits. And while you're there, you can check out past episodes of the show. You can also sign up to the newsletter. It is free, and it will remind you when we are going live, and it will email you the next day with the post. So it's a tidy little service that we offer. Great to see everybody in the chat. People are vying for my job, and that is just fine. Would love a Monday off. Ray, if you're not busy. All right, let's bring in our guests for tonight's conversation on getting the most out of that nitrogen dollar. That's right, we're talking NROI, which is a lot of letters that actually mean a lot of stuff. For tonight's conversation, we've got Soil Safari John Heard, soil fertility specialist. You know what? Can I say emeritus with Manitoba Ag? I know it's not a thing, but I'm going to start it. Can I say that, John?
I've actually been inducted into CROSS, CROSS. I'm a founding member. It's called the, let me see if I get this right, Cranky Retired Old Soil Scientist Association. And so one of the charter members amongst Don Flayton and Cindy Grant, and I can think of several other worthy members.
Yes, may I nominate some? Because I have ideas.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, offline, we'll do that. And Amanda, of course, that's a ways away, Lyle, from part of Cross. Lyle Cowell joins us from Nutrien. How are you, Lyle?
I'm good. I'm pretty sure I could fit in with the cranky old men just fine. John and I can fit into that group of people, that the bald and people with wear glasses group of people that people can't distinguish one of us from the other eventually.
That is also a thing. Also, if you've ever met Sean Haney and Bern Tobin, they often also black rim glasses, black and dark hair, tall. In real agriculture, they're the same guy. So Bern and Sean, interchangeable. Same guy. All right. Lyle, I'll start with you just to catch us up. Whereabouts you're based and what's keeping you busy this time of year with Nutrien?
Sure. Lyle Cowell, where I'm sitting here tonight is in Tisdale, Saskatchewan, in northeast Saskatchewan, in the black and gray soil zones of the northern part of the prairies. And my job is I'm the agronomist for Canada for Nutrien Wholesale, the Nutrien that manufactures nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur fertilizer. And it's really an extension role in terms of extending agronomy, understanding sustainability of those fertilizers, which I think we'll probably talk a lot about tonight. And that's really the role. And that's what's been keeping me busy, talking to farmers, talking to agronomists, talking to some of the great soil scientists that we have in Western Canada about those specific topics. And thinking about Guinness beer,
That's right.
I was thinking Guinness beer, the great foam on Guinness beer is all because it uses nitrogen gas, not CO2. So there you go. It's nitrogen is everywhere.
We're bringing it all together. Wow, bringing it all together. I have peppermint tea, but it's green enough, right, John? Yeah. So, John, this question of the return on our nitrogen dollar, this is not, of course, reserved for when crop prices are maybe not great or input prices are high, but it does put a very fine point on it when that exists, which is sort of what we're into now. In your illustrious career as a soil scientist with Manitoba Ag, what does that conversation look like as far as helping farmers determine that most economical rate or the best return on that end dollar?
It's really interesting, Lyndsey. That question comes up about once a decade. In 2008, a few years ago, and it's generally not really related to crop prices. It's when fertilizer prices spike unexpectedly. And it's interesting because in 2008, when nitrogen prices went up very high, generally without accompanying crop prices, that is when ourselves, Manitoba and several U.S. states and others worked really diligently to construct calculators for people to determine what's the impact of rising fertilizer prices on the optimum rate of N. And so we constructed these calculators, and then crop and nitrogen prices reached that spot they usually do, where they float together. It's no surprise that they float together, because often the way it's been explained to me is that, something determines crop prices, whether it's a shortage or something. And as corn generally, as corn price goes up, farmers choose to put more nitrogen on corn, and so they create more demand, and the companies are very good at increasing the prices to meet that demand. And so there's no surprise that they follow each other fairly closely, most of the time. And in most of the time, those economic rates, the people, they aren't out of whack, generally, the farmer's standard rate. But the questions we get is when one or the other gets really out of whack, and then they wonder, how much should I cut my nitrogen? It's never how much more nitrogen should I put on. It's almost always how much should I cut. And you've got an excellent clip there that you'll show from Dave Hooker, and I've got something. It'll show that rarely do we cut very much. It's tinkering. It's not slashing. It's tinkering with nitrogen rates.
Mm-hmm. Rates, of course, are one of them. One of the aspects of the things that we're going to talk about tonight, rates, of course, but also form and placement. And Lyle, maybe this is a great place to start with your slide 2, a reminder of our 4 R's. We'll quickly just go over this because I think most people have seen it. Most people are aware, but I mean, this conversation really can't happen without thinking about the 4 R's, because that does drive efficiency, because it minimizes loss. So just quickly, if you can sort of review this for us in this context.
Yeah, and it's like you say, it's a very simple concept. I don't know why we didn't think about it more years ago. We've only really started talking about this concept of the 4 R's, using fertilizer, using the right source, right at the right rate, putting it in the right place and applying it at the right time. It seemed to become more of a conversational piece only in the past few years, but it's always what I think we've tried to do. And it's also, we sometimes forget that this is always addressed within the context of the environment and economy. The right rate is not to just throw fertilizer at it at an extremely high rate that it might damage both the economy of the farm and the environment. And it's a really very simple concept. And as I said, I think that we've always done this. It's been ingrained in us in our Canadian agriculture, where really margins are almost always fairly tight. And I think we just have to keep that in mind, that we follow these 4R principles, but we remember economy and the environment as well while we're doing so.
Mm-hmm. I like how we've got the
Lyle,
3 things. Go ahead, John.
So I want to opinion, but Lyle, you're being too honest. Those of us in Western Canada, or those of you you've always been thinking the 4 R's. In a lot of the red book author, it was all that. It's only in recent years, when this has been trademarked by the fertilizer industry, that we've had the special graphic. But I think that in our discussions, we were always dealing with those. We just weren't bright enough to trademark it ourselves.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Fantastic. Okay, so one of the questions with nitrogen, always, of course, is we know nitrogen drives yield. And the question always is, and to your point, John, it's always how much, and we don't ever want to short the crop. But we have to take into account a crop's demand, but also the removal. And these are 2 different things, which I think sometimes gets lost. Some stuff gets left behind. But we also know that we have to potentially account for losses, which is where the 4R thing all comes into. So, like Peter asks, justifying 2.25 pounds of N per bushel of wheat if crop removal is only 1.3 pounds per bushel. Is that an environmental question? Is that an efficiency question? Are those numbers even accurate for something like Manitoba conditions?
Well, Peter will appreciate this, that we can do back of the envelope calculations, or we can simply do crop experiment. And when you do, the numbers are the numbers. So if you do crop response studies, and that's the amount required to produce economical responses, that's what we hang our hat on, not on back of the envelope calculations. But I was hoping not to get all wrapped up into a nitrogen lesson, having to explain immobilization to people in the East. But so I really don't want to go there, but we do know that we do immobilize portion. If you want to go to one of my slides, one of my 5 slides.
This is a joke, everyone, because there are more than 5 slides. Which slide would you like, John?
Slide number 2. I want to show this one to Peter
Slide
because
2.
this should be part of his slide set.
Yep.
And kick
There we
me. Yeah, no,
There we go.
2 before that one. Kick me in the pants. I should have been using this one years ago. Just one before that.
One for
And
that.
this was a study done in France of all places where they used labeled. No, it's one before that. Well,
I don't
maybe a
know if
little
it wants to work.
got it.
It might be. So
I'll just have to
it's-
leave Peter in suspense then. What's the
Yeah,
next
I get.
question?
I see it. No, I see it in here. For some reason, it didn't translate. I'm looking at the original PowerPoint.
Oh, Peter,
Okay.
it's
Yeah.
something that you would base your entire lecture series about. If only I could show it to you.
Yes,
But
it is.
let's move on.
This is where does the applied N go? So it's split between soil organic matter, the plant itself, leaching, and or other places.
Yeah.
So okay, all right.
It's okay.
Yep.
I'm going to leave Peter in suspense, but I can send it directly to him.
Okay,
He'll enjoy it.
that sounds great. Yeah. Okay. Now, okay, but it does bring up the question though. So Lyle, I'll go to you on this one. That obviously we want there to be enough nitrogen available to maximize yield. However, maximum yield is going to be determined by a whole bunch of other things. So because we are going to talk about protecting that nitrogen, but how does this nitrogen use efficiency equation sort of work out? How do we start to work our way towards trying so hard to make sure that we don't short the crop, but that we're not spending money we don't need to spend?
Well, there's a lot of pretty simple steps that farmers can take to make better use of the nitrogen that they have bought. And we can go back to the 4 R's. Every farmer should ask of every nutrient each one of those are. So for nitrogen for your farm, for your crop, and for your field and your growing conditions, maybe for every acre of a field, what is the right rate? And the right rate should reflect 2 things: the yield potential of the crop you're growing on that acre, which is not as high as most people think, and also a soil test. If you combine those 2, an honest yield per acre. So it's not an honest yield per farm, but per field, but per acre. It brings us to this idea of variable rate nitrogen application. And that starts with understanding what the real yield demand is going to be per acre. And then you couple that with a soil test. And, that's what a right rate is all about. And then ask yourself, what for my crop that I'm growing on that acre, what is the right time to apply it? What is the right place to apply it? And then you start to get efficiency in the fertilizer that you've bought, growing more crop for the nitrogen that you have bought and improve that efficiency. We often in the past used to think of fertilizer use efficiency for nitrogen to be maybe 40-50%. And there's good data, and I think to suggest that we can achieve 80 or 90% if we do it right, following those 4 R's and getting it right. And I think a lot of farmers are achieving that range of efficiency now. There was questions in the side panel about, and John addressed it already, but and it's been addressed a little bit in the questions as far as nitrogen removal rates. And John, you and I are both part of the project, the Prairie Nutrient Removal Calculator, and that's a good reference for anybody listening, whether you're in Eastern or Western Canada. And so that suggested to us that our hard red spring wheat in Western Canada removes about 1.5 pounds of N per bushel. Uptake, whatever it is, 1.8, 1.9 pounds per bushel. And then that means, numbers that John is using, 2.2 pounds of N applied, probably means that you're setting a fertilizer use efficiency of close to 80%. That's pretty darn good, far better than we used to. And that's the first big step that a farmer can take, is just to really focus on each one of those 4 Rs.
Now, okay, so we've got some great slides here that sort of break down we've got some really good charts and all sorts of things. And one of them that we are going to get to, Lyle, it has an excellent discussion on that. Really, you should always be putting your N in the soil, not on the soil, as sort of a bottom line. So I do want to get to that one in a minute. But before we do that, Dr. Dave Hooker and Bernd Tobin in a recent, well, it's not so recent, but in a corn school, do a really good job of digging into the MERN, the most economical rate of nitrogen. And Dave's got some fantastic slides that he walks through. I have pulled just a clip to sort of frame this conversation, and there's some good questions that come out of it. But I highly recommend everyone, and if you want the direct link, I can put it in the post for this episode to the entire conversation. But producer Jay, if you would, will go to our clip with Dr. Dave Hooker and Bernd Tobin on MERN.
If I picked my nitrogen rate to be within within $5 an acre of the maximum, I'd be really satisfied. That is a good news scenario if I can pick my nitrogen rate just at the precise amount to be within $5 per acre of the maximum. And this is the range here. So on this graph, I had that range would vary between 167 to 198 pounds per acre of nitrogen. So really, based on this, we don't have to get that nitrogen rate right on 184 pounds per acre of nitrogen. We have really quite a range to work with. So as long as we're within that, between 167 pounds per acre and 198 pounds per acre, we're within $5 per acre of the maximum net return. And if I pick my nitrogen rate at that on my farm, I'd be ecstatic. I'd be very happy. Of course, the question is, what would the MERN be if the price ratio was 12? And so I've been getting quotes of 28% nitrogen, over $800 a ton. And that equates to about $1.30 per pound of actual nitrogen. So that's about double what we saw in 2020. Just incredible price increase. And so if we kept the price of corn the same at $6 a bushel, and we assumed a price of nitrogen around $1.38 a pound of nitrogen, that would make our price ratio of 12. So it went from 6 in 2020 to 12 possibly in 2022, which is just incredible price increase. So what would the MERN be? Well, if we look at the MERN using a price ratio of 12, our MERN drops from 184 to only 170. And so this is quite surprising to many. It seems like the rate should drop more than just 14 pounds per acre of nitrogen. So again, that's with nitrogen $1.30 a pound, corn at $6 a bushel, and price ratio of 12. And we look at that highest net return, that 170 pounds per acre of nitrogen. If we wanted to be within that $5 per acre, that rate would be between 151 and 180 pounds per acre of nitrogen. So there's a lot of flexibility around that MERN rate. You don't have to hit it straight on to be within that $5 per acre.
Our sponsors tonight are FMC Pre-School, Nutrien and Economics, and the Corn School. Big corn yields demand intense management. From tillage strategies to nitrogen management, variety selection, pest management, and more, Real Agriculture's Corn School is a video and podcast series that helps you face every moment of the growing season. The Corn School is made possible by support from BASF and Pride Seeds. Learn more at cornschool.com.
All right. So what I find fascinating in that conversation is I would have thought that it would have moved more. So Lyle, is it, and I know that's corn, but I mean the same dynamic exists, and we can actually, Producer Jay, if you could bring up Lyle slide 5. Why is it that maybe the most economical rate does move, but it doesn't necessarily swing wildly down, even if nitrogen is more expensive?
Well, we there's a lot of things here, and the example here I have is obviously not corn, and it's a different environment than you would have in most corn growing regions, where the climate is much more conducive to high yields than a lot of Western Canada. But I think that something that we always have to keep in mind is that nitrogen is expensive. Fertilizer is expensive, and it's always going to be expensive. Let's face it. But we are often working on a part of the nitrogen curve where the slope is pretty steep, and if you may not be on that part of the nitrogen curve where it's the top of the curve, and the shifting it back and forth isn't going to have a big yield impact. A lot of farmers work on the part of the curve where the slope is steep, and if you cut back nitrogen rates by even 20 pounds of N per acre, you can have a pretty significant yield loss. So this example here, it's just assuming that there's only 20 pounds of nitrate N per acre available to the crop, so a relatively deficient field, and then using relatively moderate nitrogen rates on a wheat crop. So following some of the standardized N response curves, that drop of N of 20 pounds per acre, it has the risk of potentially reducing your yield. And there's comments in the sidebar from those listening that there's also the risk that the price might increase. So what if you reduce your N rates, save some dollars, in the meantime, price of your crop is increased by $1 or $2, and you've lost some yield. Now, the big problem here is that a big part of the farm costs are fixed. You bought your land, you bought your combine, you have to turn the lights on in the morning. Those are fixed costs that you can't change. And the real profit on most farms in a year like this, where the margins are slim, most of the time, I think that the profitability of the farm is going to be based on fixed costs, not whether you move that N rate back and forth, 10 pounds of N per acre, or those little shifts here and there. It's those big costs that are going to be the anchor to whether or not you have profit or not.
Mm-hmm.
So a very different environment, but really the same answer. Shifting those N rates just aren't going to make a big difference to whether or not you're going to save money or not. And the risk really is, will you possibly lose income?
Mm-hmm. And so to me, and John, jump in here if you like, but this is where sort of the second part of the conversation then comes in, which is, so obviously we don't want to apply nitrogen we don't need, and we don't want to apply nitrogen that isn't going to get used by the crop. And that is incredibly important. The crop may have needed it. We just may have put it in the wrong form or at the wrong time or the wrong place, and we end up losing it, which we don't want either. But to me, the second part of this conversation is exactly that. So if spending less or adding less nitrogen isn't necessarily, it actually carries risks, isn't necessarily the solution. The solution then to making sure these dollars count is to make sure that they do end up where we want them, and that is in the crop and in the yield. So John, that's maybe where I want to take the next part of this conversation. Go ahead. Yes.
I'm just a fan of Dave Hooker's, and after you shared this clip with us in advance, and so I'm not a smart person on my own, but I know how to follow smart people. So I ran the same scenarios that Dave did on corn with Manitoba wheat and Manitoba canola and Manitoba corn and North Dakota wheat and corn, and some very similar stories to be told. Now, the one thing I want to mention is I'm not going to ask you to chase any more slides. Let's just
No,
be
it's
done with
okay.
that.
I think it's only
No,
that one that didn't work.
no,
Which
no,
one do
no
you
more
want?
slides.
Slide number
Give it
23,
one
John.
plug here. But I'm going to say our economic calculators all fertilize almost to the top flat part of the curve. And where the last dollar spent on nitrogen gives $1 a crop. And there actually is a pretty wide window there. As Dave mentioned, his window was fairly narrow, only about 30 pounds of nitrogen. In some of our calculations, there's a 40-pound window or buffer to still be within $5 per acre of maximum profit. So that's something we need to acknowledge, is that up there on the towards getting onto the plateau or close to it there's quite a bit of wiggle room. And for that, we've always suggested to farmers, or the North Dakota people do in their wiggle room, and said, well, if you're growing and you've got conditions conducive to losses, you slide to the higher end of that. If there's greater risk, price risk, for example, you could slide to the lower end of that margin. The other thing is, is the difference. That's just a bunch of clutter. If people want to diddle with that, they can go to the website below.
Ask John.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
There you go.
but yeah. So the thing is, most of our calculations are done up towards the top part or steep part or not steep part of that, and it's only when you move off onto what Lyle was talking there, the steep part, that's where the consequences of dropping 10, 20 pounds per acre are consequential. And even more so, I'm sure we'll get to it, even wheat is even more important, because before we lose yield in wheat, we will lose protein. And then all of a sudden you're moving your returns per bushel down. So we're pretty shy when it comes time to reducing rates of nitrogen on wheat, because we're not just impacting yield, but we could be impacting protein. There's that number that Peter doesn't like, 2.25 pounds.
That's right.
Per bushel. So Peter, look at a chart instead. Knock yourself out. We got charts, we got words, we got pounds per bushel.
We got it all. Okay. So it really does, but this is, I think, really important to see, is that exactly that. If you're working on that much flatter part, so if we're at our top end ish, small movements in there, less risky as far as dropping any yield. But realistically, in my mind, this is about we don't want to short the crop because we could leave money on the table, but we want to make sure that what we apply actually gets used. I mean, to me, that's really the important part here, is that we're good managers. We understand our yield potential. If the water comes, and this is the one big difference between Ontario, of course, and the West, is that for some of our growers in Western Canada, it may not rain. And when I say it may not rain, I don't mean it may not rain a lot. I mean it may not rain. And that's a full sentence. So that is a completely different ballgame than that. And that, Lyle, I think, is where you're on that steep part of that curve, right? Is that realistically the crop potential can leap bounds higher if it actually rains. John, go ahead. Yep.
I just, since it's up here, I just want to mention two things that these curves kind of tell me along what you're talking. You're talking about rain. Note that all our recommendations in the West are based on total nitrogen, which we call the fertilizer nitrogen that people apply, plus the nitrate nitrogen in the top 2 feet. So we measure that out here. So that bottom part of that axis is fertilizer nitrogen and soil test nitrogen. But we could see if we go up the y-axis or the axis going up, we're still producing yield with 0 nitrogen and 0 nitrate. And that is the contribution from organic matter mineralization. And in these curves, why is it started at a different place? Some of those are simply because of moisture in the West. If we have good moisture, we tend to get more mineralization. We tend to have higher yield potential. Sometimes we get those same yields with the same rate of nitrogen if that mineralization kind of coincides. And we really see that with corn out here. We get a moist year, we get high yields of corn, even if we haven't fertilized with it, because Mineralization kicks in when we have moisture, but it's unpredictable out here, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
So
So
sorry for distracting you. You could take the
no,
conversation back.
that's okay. We can, John. The world is our oyster. We can do whatever we want. Or I guess today, the world is our Guinness. We can do whatever we want. And please don't put green dye in it. Okay. Mark's got a good point here in that. So one of the ways, of course, that we can manage our nitrogen and manage the risk of loss is we can choose enhanced efficiency products, which we will talk about, but we also can split our nitrogen. But Mark says that they run 1.1 pounds of N per bushel of corn, all applied up front, stabilized and worked in at planting. He gave up on side dressing from too much variability at that nitrate timing and suffering from tip back. So he's thinking ESN or pure yield. I don't know what that is. So sorry about that much. I know what ESN is, but the question often comes up of splitting N. That question of, how much do you put up front? How much do you add in? And of course, here in Ontario, we do for the corn, we wait for that nitrate test. But it can be tricky to make decisions then. Lyle, is the goal of splitting N saving pounds of N or being able to sort of top up based on good conditions when it comes to sort of the growers that you're working with?
I think the goal of splitting in depends on what crop and in what environment. If you get into some parts of Western Canada that are at risk of drought, some people will hold back their N with the idea that they will top dress N if rains come, so significant rains come in June. That's often a mistake, to be quite honest. The time period that we have to take up that nitrogen is pretty narrow in the spring, and there's a unfortunate habit that people will decide to top dress their N after it's rained. It makes more for efficiency of uptake. It'd be better if you put the nitrogen top dress the nitrogen the day before it rained. It's not often happens, and the top dressing coincides with a lot of other farm operations, and so sometimes it just doesn't happen. But that is a strategy that some people take. The mention of ESN, some people will replace some of their upfront nitrogen and use ESN because it will delay the availability of some of the N for that purpose as well. Now, you get into corn growing areas, high yield areas. I think the primary strategy in splitting N tends to be to avoid some of the losses associated with early season application, and that's fine. If you're in an area that your corn, for one thing, has a lot more weeks to take up nitrogen than a spring wheat crop, so you have a wider window to top dress that N, and you may avoid some risk of loss with heavy rains in the spring, leaching, denitrification, and so on. So top dressing N really there is, I think, the primary focus is to avoid losses more so than to adjust according to hopefully better yields.
So, John, and this is a question that often comes up, and Brent has asked it here. So, in thinking about corn, now it says when you strip till in corn, but either way, I do think the question of nitrogen stabilizers with split applications comes up often with corn. So, if I am topping up my corn, I'm going for a top dress, the question does come up about should I be using some sort of enhanced efficiency product at that time? When would it be a yes? We have dual, we have single. Which one am I using? So what form of loss am I worried about if I'm top dressing corn?
So am I talking about the top dress component or the base
for now.
component?
Yes, the top dress component first.
Okay. Well, as far as the top dress component, you're only worried about volatilization at that point. So keep the stuff from gassing off, put it in the ground, and you don't need to worry about that so much. But we've done studies, Don Flayton's done studies out here, and when you, if you dribble 28% into corn, I know you have a clip down there about people that add stabilizers to it, but out here, a urease inhibitor really hasn't helped much when it's dribbled in season. We maybe don't have volatilization conditions, and volatilization is I know it's accelerated by heat, but it also is somewhat contained within the canopy because it's not windy. So we haven't measured or seen yield impact. But if volatilization in season is a big thing for you guys, well, spend your money on a pill or a chemical like a urease inhibitor, or just put the darn stuff in the ground. Like I think we're going to get to this, that you can diddle with this thing with the inhibitors, or you can just use the place part, put it in the ground, and then we've got the way to do that. And my neighbor down in Ontario does that very nicely, and with a side dress unit, and even puts closing discs on it so it doesn't come out. So it'll work. But yeah, my thought is that if you're going to use an inhibitor, it's probably, if you're going to use a nitrification inhibitor, it's something you're using up front in the season to protect it against all the rain you get. And you're probably only going to do that if you're using something like UAN that has nitrogen in the nitrate component already.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, another shout out to one of my gold stars here. Fabian Fernandez does excellent work at University of Minnesota, and has up some work on nitrogen management on clay loam soils, tile drained or not tile drained. And he said, you know, if they've got these soils tile drained, there was no advantage to split nitrogen. But if they're left in an undrained state, you can either put on like 25 or more pounds more nitrogen, or do the split. And that's where, so he's really getting to, you know, denitrification is the main thing on poorly drained soils. And so you can either get the darn thing tile drained, or then you need to start using some improved placement or probably inhibitors.
Mm-hmm. Pete says that placement in the soil, being sure to close the slot, is much more time consuming, and therefore surface dribble.
Too bad. Too bad.
So I would like to point out to everyone in Ontario.
How big are your farms, Peter?
Yeah,
How
you
big are
don't
your farms
have
compared to dairy farms?
3,000 acres to cover, or 5,000 acres to cover. I think we can get it done. But really good point about the drainage, John. That, I mean, the risk of, say, saturated soils, et cetera, I mean, that is, I mean, let's face it, well-drained soil just is better all around. And so it's a huge improvement for many things. Now, Lyle, so thinking about it the other way, and good point about the upfront, and about the moisture component, I do have a clip that talks about, you know, if you're, you know, splitting and using nitrogen or enhanced nitrogen efficiency products, and where they fit. And, you know, to John's point, there is a fit for them, for sure. But depending on the situation, you may just be better off with a different placement, potentially, than worrying so much about it. So how do you work that through, you know, in the less wet, more dry scenarios?
Can we look at the slide that I have? That's
Of course
pretty
we
simple.
can. Yep.
2 bars, banded
Yes.
or not banded.
I think it's yeah. Which slide is it? Hang on.
I only had 5 in like John, so
Yeah,
Slide number
I think it's 8. Yeah, I think it's 8, which is great. Love the colors.
Oh, okay. It threw it around a little bit in the.
It did.
Yeah,
it did a little bit. Same idea though.
So you get this question: what is the difference between the efficiency in broadcast application event versus banded application event? And we have known this for decades. These numbers come from the 1993 publication, the Red Book. Through the 1970s and 80s, when banding became an option to farmers, there was a lot of work, tremendous amount of research to compare banded application versus broadcast application. And these bars here represent over 100 site years of data. And so in terms of yield, the average efficiency a band being about 15% higher yielding on average over 100 site years of data than a broadcast application of urea. And in terms of total uptake, efficiency, which you get paid for if you're being paid for grain protein, almost a 30% boost in efficiency. A band is better. And if we could find a way to create a band for all crops, it's better. Now, it's true that it's true that a surface band is actually better than a simple broadcast as well. There's some protection even within a surface band to reduce losses. But my opinion, and I think from what Sean said, you might agree, is the first steps is not to find a new product to improve your efficiency, but to improve your practices, which might not actually cost you much to do. It's been well demonstrated, excellent research, and it's just like I say, this is published a long time ago now, 1993. This data summary, and I sometimes think we want to reinvent the wheel in finding new ways of broadcasting nitrogen fertilizer, and it's not going to make it better. A band is still better.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have two other things I want to talk about.
Is very important.
Yeah, I like it. There you go. These are very key things, Lyle. Mark's got a really great question about stabilizing N on winter wheat. So I do want to go to that. We're just going to, Producer Jay, if you would, we'll go to our last tweet of the night, because there's also a question that Pete and I talked about on today's radio show. And John, you want to talk about it with the potassium question as well. So we'll first go to our read, and then we'll come back to Mark's question. It's a really good one.
Our sponsors tonight are Nutrien Economics, Corn School, and FMC Pre-School. FMC Pre-School is an education and stewardship extension of FMC Canada with a firm mandate to bring educational value to you regarding proactive weed control and resistance management best practices. Learn more at fmcpreschool.com.
Fantastic comments tonight. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Ray, for explaining to me what pure yield was. I appreciate it. Peter as well. So Mark's question is about stabilizing nitrogen on winter wheat. So we are gearing up here in Ontario. For some in the south, they've already got some wheat that's broke dormancy. There will be much more in the next few weeks that do, and we'll be thinking about this first pass. Maybe it's not of nitrogen this early, maybe it's sulfur, but eventually to nitrogen. So on that question, if we're going into winter wheat, we're going with our first pass. It says, Mark says his local co-op is really pushing Anvol, so a product, tells me to ignore the higher CECs, cation exchange capacity, I'm guessing. Okay, and just stabilize it. Thoughts? Okay, so John, I'll go to you first. Winter wheat, early N. What do we need to consider if we're going to decide to stabilize our N or not?
I would say the weather forecast, if you've got the ability to be flexible for that. But yes, even here we see response, a good benefit to using urease inhibitor like Anvol if conditions are conducive for volatilization loss. And so farmers generally understand those conditions really well. Other than some nuances, the worst case example is to have a moist soil surface that will break down or dissolve the urea pellet right away, and then followed by warm, dry weather with the drying winds. And you'll continue to have nitrogen losses until that soil surface dries out. So what is safer is if the soil surface is bone dry, you could go on there, drop on your urea or UAN, and you're really not going to experience much losses until you have moisture moving up from below or a light rain. So if Mark has the flexibility to commit based on weather, but if he wants to be risk averse with his practice, then he's probably leaning towards treating it with a urease inhibitor. Out here, it isn't a iron-proof urease inhibitor, but because we grow a lot of canola, we have crops that respond to sulfur quite often. And people out here, most of our winter wheat, if there is probably it's applied not as urea, but dribbled UAN. And if we put ammonium thiosulfate in there, that adds as a slight inhibitor of volatilization. Simply the dribbling of 28% reduces the volatilization losses quite a bit. So there's things that Mark could do possibly with placement also if it's liquid that he's using.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Lyle, do you have anything to add to that one on the, great job, John. That was an excellent answer. Oh, apparently not good enough. He's left. Well, John should be coming back, but Lyle, under, I guess, to look at it more under, let's say, Western conditions. I know Mark's here in Ontario, but under more Western conditions, where do we have, because I know John mentioned this as well, that at times we can't count on the same kind of responses or the same kind of savings maybe that we see in Ontario with higher moisture areas. So in lower moisture areas, where do we see the best fit for some of these enhanced efficiency products?
If you get into a case where, again, it's not to say we think of Western Canada is dry, but it's not always dry. Certainly Manitoba was sopping wet last year. And then you need to look at the tools in the toolbox, really. If you're broadcasting nitrogen on a wet soil like John described, and I drove through Manitoba last spring. Soil was sopping wet. It was hot out. Tremendous potential for volatile losses of nitrogen. And if you run into those conditions, then you should use the tools that you have at your disposal. It's not to say that enhanced efficiency fertilizers are going to be of value every time you use them, but they can be of value when the conditions are right. I would add one other crop, and the crop that we always forget about is forages. You don't have a lot of options in forages, and sometimes to get the timing right, you can't wait around for 3 weeks for the next rain, and maybe you do need to have an enhanced efficiency fertilizer to fertilize, put some nitrogen fertilizer on a forage crop. There's a lot of things you can do to improve forages and management of forages, but applying some nitrogen is one of those. And it's one of our big crops that we forget about, and that's where, especially a volatilization urease inhibitor is going to be helpful.
Mm-hmm. It's a really good point. We do. Thank you, Lyle, because forages are near and dear to my heart, and no one ever
Yes,
mentions.
you grow sheep.
Yes, I do. Poorly, but still, there they are. So it's a good way to, and Lyle, thanks for that, because I think that's the other important point is there's the choice of what's the best option, but then there's the realistic, well, I'm going to have to do fill in the blank, right? And so then it's the best, not as great option. And this is where some of these products can come in to help minimize some of that risk, or at least keep that nitrogen where we want it, as close to where we want it to go as possible. So that's important. Now, one of the things that I think is very cool, and so Pete and I talked about this on Real Ag Radio today, but I'm always fascinated by the interplay between nutrients, and that realistically, you can have all the nitrogen in the world, but if you're missing some other key nutrients, that efficiency of that N to be used is going to drop. And one of the ones that maybe we don't think of enough is potassium, is K. So John, what do we need to know about our potassium levels when it comes to nitrogen use efficiency?
Well, it's interesting you bring this up. We're blessed in most of this province with clay loam soils that are naturally high in potassium, and that leads us into some bad habits or general, because we also have some depleted sandy soils. And if you look at recommendations for those, according to soil tests, sometimes the nitrogen and potassium recommendations are almost the same. But what happens when potassium is lacking in the plant? Nitrogen just not very efficient, and response curves to nitrogen may be fairly flat until the potassium needs of the crop are met. And so it's one of those ones that until the potassium needs are met, we're not going to see the improvement in yield and quality that we would expect with nitrogen.
Now, Lyle, the other one I think about that perhaps because we've got canola, or as you mentioned, forages, alfalfa in rotation, sulfur is the other one that gets maybe not as much attention as it should, but perhaps in the West gets a bit more because we've always had to apply it, and we have big users in rotation. But what is the relationship with sulfur to N?
Yeah, I often hear now people talking about the rediscovering sulfur, especially in the eastern states and eastern Canada as a deficient nutrient. Western Canada never had the benefit of a lot of sulfur coming from pollutants, and so we are very well familiar with the requirement of having sufficient sulfur to make efficient use of nitrogen. And really it comes down to it's the old Liebig barrel stave scenario, where if you're very deficient in one nutrient, it doesn't matter how much you apply of the other nutrient, it's not going to get better. So, going back decades, really, canola in Western Canada, depending on which paper you read, needs the ratio of application, if you are deficient in both nitrogen and sulfur, would be a ratio of about, let's split the differences, say 6 to 1, 6 pounds of N per pound of sulfur, if both of them are deficient. That doesn't mean that if you have 1,000 pounds of sulfur in your soil, you don't need to apply 6,000 pounds of nitrogen. But that we've long realized that if you don't overcome a sulfur deficiency with canola, it doesn't matter how much nitrogen you apply. And now we see the same thing being rediscovered in eastern Canada with corn. That, holy mackerel, I put on 250 pounds of N and my crop was sulfur deficient and it didn't yield very well. It's the same scenario. You just have to make sure that you have sufficient nutrients of every nutrient, whether it be nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, and certainly potassium. And just have to think of this not just pouring on more nitrogen all the time, but to apply enough of everything. You often hear the word balance, and then that implies that there's certain ratios that must be exactly applied of nutrients, and I think that that's a misdirection. I think just remembering that you have to have enough of each nutrient to achieve the yield goal that you think that you can achieve.
So I guess that's it, because Mark sort of follows up with, all right, so then what soil test level of potassium is optimum for N-use efficiency? It is going to depend on what yield you're actually going for then. Like you really do have to dig a bit deeper, John, or no?
Oh, I know. I don't know. I think it varies by your area. I'm presuming Mark is in the east, and
Yes.
so
Yep.
down east there, I think the critical level's about 100 to 125 parts per million generally. And so if you've met those amounts, then I would expect the nitrogen response curve to behave properly. But my dad's farm was in London, Ontario, and I love going back to his old soil test that we took over, rented land to a dairy farmer that just took everything away. The soil test levels for potassium, hold your seat, Lyle, were 30 parts per million for potassium. So the first thing the old University of Guelph lab did is we poured on potassium for the first 3 or 4 years and it built it up. It did an admirable job following those government recommendations to get potassium up into a good working range, and then we will replace where other nutrients would work well. So I still use that in my talks out here to show about how when you're dreadfully deficient, you need to address those real deficiencies in order to expect profitability out of your other nutrients too.
Yeah, I will second Peter's comment that balance is not necessarily helpful, because that implies that you would have equal amounts or that everything would get its sort of shake. It's really about what your soil can offer, what you're going to add, and what that crop needs and when. So it's far more complicated, but recognizing that if one of them is way out of whack, it doesn't matter how much of the others that you add in. It's simply not going to work. Brent asks, best all-around starter for corn. So lots of corn questions, which I love. But John, you work more with corn than Lyle does. This is always, I think, a question on corn is a big fertility user, and trying to get it right is a tough one. Is there such thing as a best, or what do we have to consider in a starter?
I'm sorry, my earplug didn't catch that from Brent.
Sorry.
What was the question again at the front?
It is so best all-around starter for corn. So what nutrients do we need in a corn starter?
Oh, a starter. Okay, I apologize. Well, it's not fair to ask someone as old as me to remember how a person should grow corn in Ontario. But how we should do it here is that the primary nutrient is phosphorus that we need to have, because we're putting out here corn we're planting while the soil is still frozen, generally deep in the profile. So cold soils are a reality, and diffusion or access from the soil is very slight when it's that cold. So that's why phosphorus is important. Another one that we need out here is zinc. And a lot of my neighbors in this particular area, I know this isn't common in Ontario yet, but we have a lot of air tanks out here. Farmers have air seeders, they love air tanks. We are pulling an increasingly number of air tanks behind our corn planters and blowing dry P&K in the 2x2 placement because it's cheaper than 1034O or other phosphorus products, but it also allows placement of potassium on our sandy soils. So I love the way that farmers are, still doing some plumbing and welding in the winter here, and really what I call putting nutrients where they're required. Now, farmers that are strip tilling down your way, that to me, that fertility placement is what sets strip tillers ahead, is that they build a bit of enriched fertility zone in that root zone with placement, and so that's one of their pluses. So I mentioned, I would differ though. In Ontario studies, it's showing more need for nitrogen in the starter blends than I think we see out here. So I would say you better follow up with someone from Ontario to see how much nitrogen you need in your starter. I shouldn't speak to that.
I think that, so Lyle, the starter question is perhaps a little bit different in the West. We certainly talk about pop-up or starter fertilizers, but often, again, that phosphorus question seems to be early on the biggest thing that's going to come up is phosphorus.
Yeah, and really, it's not different from what John said. Apologize.
No worries.
For the call.
Lyle, you need some of this.
You need some green beverage, apparently. Yeah.
I do. We know that, as John said, our cold soils, and in Western Canada, we're often seeding cold soil. Now, what we call cold soil is different than what a lot of regions call cold soil. Sometimes the soil's frozen when we're seeding. It's very cold. Sometimes it's cold and dry. Those conditions, you need to have some phosphorus near the seedling root zone. It doesn't need to be in the seed row, near the seedling root system. So phosphorus is the place to start. Basal rates of potassium also, because it's not very mobile in the soil. So that's the place to start. And it's based on mobility of the nutrients as well as the conditions of the soils that we're working with.
And also, but let's not burn our seed, right, John? So anytime we're thinking, let's not put anything in there that's going to necessarily cause issues. So there is a limit to what we can put down.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. We are out of time. And there's still enough time, if everyone goes out now, to go get a green beer. I will not be doing that because I'm going to go to bed. But and I will continue to drink my green tea. But thank you both. for joining me tonight on The Agronomist. Thank you, everyone in the comments, for some fantastic questions, a great discussion. Ray should have been the host, really, to be honest, and maybe could be part of Cross. I wrote it down, John. I'm going to keep that one in mind.
I apologize for being a little too cranky, but at least I didn't have to bring out my shillelagh that you've got. That used to be my gavel at the soil fertility meetings. But I apologize to people for being short with you, and I'll get back to you with those special slides.
Immobilization. It's important. Some of the end goes there. Okay. Lyle, John, thank you so much for joining me in the Agronomists. Next week, we're going to be talking creepy crawlies. We're going to be talking about early season insect pests. So check that out. That's, of course, Monday night, 8 p.m. Eastern. We'll see you next week. Happy St. Paddy's Day. Cheers, everybody.
Yep, very good.